Madrid. Dave began writing for Macmillan in 1994, and his latest series is Gateway, the second edition. He has given talks in 28 countries and is one of the plenary speakers at the YLTSIG pre-conference event in Liverpool happening on the 1st of April. And so lovely to have you here, Dave. So now take it away.
Thank you very much, Joan. Yeah, it's brilliant to be here. Wonderful to sort of see so many people from all around the world. The problem always with these things is time, because I always have too much to say. I will be looking at the chat box, but it's probably best, like other people, to keep the questions till the end. From time to time, I may ask you a question, so please feel free to answer yes or no or whatever you like in the chat box, okay? Now, in this session, I'm talking about how the level of students in general in schools, primary and secondary, is going up. If you're not in Spain, you might wonder what this has to do with you. Well, I think firstly, of course, we're all interested in increasing the level of our students. It's probably the one thing that we all agree about is that our job is to get the students' level higher. So I think it's good to share a success story. Also, I have traveled a lot with Gateway around the world. I've been to, I think, 28 countries. And from what I've seen talking to teachers, from visiting schools, I think that rising levels are quite a common theme around the world. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of decide what is helping the level to go up in general, okay? Obviously, each country, each region might be slightly different, but I think there are common things that maybe we can learn. And thirdly, I will be making some predictions about the future, and I think it's always interesting to think about where we're heading as teachers. Where are we going in the future? And I might be completely wrong, but that's always fun to make predictions about the future and get it wrong, okay? Afterwards, we can laugh about it. Now, I'm basing the evidence for a lot of my talk on two very interesting documents. You can find both of them free to download as PDFs. One is English Impact on the left, and that if you put into Google English Impact British Council Spain, you will find that document easily. Another is a fascinating document called 2025, The Future of English, also the British Council. And I do recommend you to look at those two documents because I think you'll find them quite fascinating. Having said that, my predictions for the future are actually my own, and my interpretation of the data is my own. So please do not blame the British Council for any of that. That's my fault, okay? Now, I think the fascinating thing for me, I have been teaching in Spain for 30 years, and me and my colleagues, we used to joke about the level of our students because students never really got better. And it was definitely considered that in Spain, the level always stayed the same. And now that is just not true. Suddenly we've realized that our students are developing really, really quickly. The statistics here, which you can discover exactly how they did the analysis, how they did the testing, but the basic information here, if you look at the top, 34% of 15 to 16-year-old students in the Madrid area, where I am, have a B2 or C1 level. Now, I don't know about your countries, certainly in Spain 10 years ago, that was definitely not the case. Anecdotally, in my school, I could clearly say that 20 years ago, 1 or 2 students maybe did first certificate and passed, whereas nowadays, over 50% of my students are probably taking first and passing. So there is evidence in this document that the level is changing. Obviously, we're taking a general global look at the level, so individual differences will be there. But on the whole, the level is rising. So the question is, why? And I've put these different factors, and I've said they're possible factors that I, from my anecdotal feeling of teaching here in Spain, these are the things that possibly explain the rise in level. And they're in no particular order. But if you look at number 1 here, the number of hours that people in Spain, that children are, in Spain are studying English is the highest in Europe. Now, that's obviously not a guarantee that students will always learn just because they're getting lots of hours. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that also the number of hours will be important. Obviously, all students in Spain are starting primary 6 years old, but actually, many children are starting in Spain kindergarten and preschool. And again, obviously, it'd be interesting to compare with your own countries, regions. Is that the same or different? But I think the first factor, probably for the explanation of the rising level, is the total number of hours of English tuition. Secondly, maybe some of you know about the Bilingual project, which is quite famous actually. It's being studied in many different places. In Madrid, in the area, the region of Madrid, there is a bilingual program. And I will say now, we could talk about this for a long time because there is some controversy. Not everybody is convinced about this. Maybe on the English side, yes, but on the general education side, maybe less so. But it is interesting that in Madrid we have this bilingual program, which means that in state schools or schools with government funding, lots of schools, so we can see that 46% of primary schools, 51% of secondary schools are doing these extra subjects in English. So 30% of the timetable is given in English. So we've got subjects such as biology, history, geography. These things are being given in English, even physical education. As you can see, the only subjects not given in English tend to be obviously Spanish language and maths, maybe because of the conceptual level. But I think this bilingual program has obviously had an effect in general on the level, and it's helping the level to go up. Now, I think this third factor is something that is definitely not a question of Spain. I think it's worldwide. But you can tell me if you agree or disagree in the chat box. But I think that in general, it's clear that English now is seen as a skill which students need to have, they have to find a job. And not only to find a job, but probably they need English within their job. When I started teaching 30 years ago, I think that it was common to need English for a job, but you would never actually use it. But I think now around the world, you not only need it as a certificate, as a piece of paper, you need to be able to use English within the workplace. And I think that that is consolidating this idea of English as a world language, which, whether we like it or not, I think is probably generally accepted around the world. And I think in terms of children, obviously, there is serious parental pressure that students at primary and secondary learn English, because everybody agrees that English will be necessary in your future life to get a good job and to rise above and to succeed in life. The fourth factor, which I find maybe the most fascinating, because this information, these statistics are pretty amazing for me. I find this really amazing. If you look at the diagram, it's saying the language most regularly used to watch, read, or listen to different types of media. Now, this is fascinating. So I'm talking, this is about Spain, the Madrid area, but look at that, 44% of 15 to 16-year-olds are using English to play computer games. 25% are using English as the normal language to use social networks. 22% are using English, they're reading, listening to English on the internet. Films, and in fact, in one of the British Council documents, Game of Thrones was actually listed as a reason that students had learnt English. I think that English is now the international language of entertainment. And again, this sounds strange, but I'm getting old. When I started teaching 30 years ago, we had a few books, we had a few magazines, newspapers, we had a few old VHS videos in English, but now at a click of a switch, we have films, TV series, Netflix, and it's all in English. And I think this is really a key factor to explaining why and how students are increasing their level. And I think those statistics are really, really interesting, because we have to imagine this is all outside the classroom. So we're already teaching English, but then outside the classroom, our students are using English, which is great for us as teachers of English. I think that it's pretty clear that in the last 10, 20 years, the level of teachers is going up, the level of their English, the level of their training. I think that the level of teaching materials is continually going up. Obviously, as the author of course books, I would like to think that that's happening. But I think that generally there is this nice situation where the level of all of us as teachers, trainers, authors, it's going up. And I think that's obviously a key factor in explaining how the students' level is also rising. And then also, I believe that external exams are becoming increasingly important. I did notice a comment somebody said, Katerina said exams are getting easier, and I sort of know where that comment is coming from. I do think that external exams are an important part in this idea of proving. When we talk about how the level is going up, we can only prove it when students are doing exams. And an external exam is a great way for state schools, for private schools, for all of us to say, yes, we are getting better. Our students' level is getting better. And I think that this, an exam can be a stressful thing, it can be a negative thing, but it can be also a very positive thing where we are aiming for something higher. And finally, in this section 6, I really do believe that particularly here, where in the past there was a pretty depressing idea about English and the English level, I think success does breed success. When the level starts going up and students pass exams and they feel like they are doing better, then this leads to a psychological breakthrough. So I think all of these things, and other factors too, but I think these things are helping the level of our students to rise. Okay, Céline, I'll answer your question at the end. Can you remind me, and I will come back to your question. I haven't forgotten it, okay, but I will forget it. Right, now, the next question for me, which is interesting, is what does this mean about the future of teaching English at secondary, upper secondary? I think firstly, what is happening is because of lots of CLIL teaching in primary, where students are learning English by studying other subjects, I think there is this real need for us as English teachers to make sure we are teaching interesting content, challenging content. We are teaching something through English, and we are not just teaching English. I think nowadays our students are expecting more, and I think that we are entering this phase. Some people have talked today about life skills. I think that we really are preparing students for life after school, okay? And I think that this will become more and more a key factor in teaching secondary, that we're not just teaching the present perfect, but we have to teach something through English, not just English. Secondly, and this I think is a really interesting area that will be more and more developed in the future, I think there's this real need to teach thinking. Now, some people have already mentioned today critical thinking. What is fascinating is that even in the university entrance exam in this Madrid area where I teach, 2 of the evaluation criteria are now originality of ideas and justification for opinions. And I think this is really interesting. It is no longer okay just to say, I think X is this because. We have to give more and more deeper reasons. We have to think higher. This higher thinking skills is becoming more and more important. And what I find fascinating is sometimes we need to question, what are we evaluating? Are we evaluating the level of English or the level of thought, the level of maturity of thought, the level of sophistication of thought? And I'm going to give you a simple example. This, I think, I really don't know anymore, but this, I think, was from an exam in Italy. It was a writing exam where the students had to write quite a few words, okay? It was 200, 300 words. And I'd like you to look at some of those questions, okay? For example, number 3, hope. What meaning can hope have in our lives? Okay. Or number 5, beauty is being in harmony with what you are. what is meant by this statement? Do you agree? Now, the reason that I've put those questions there is because me, as an educated, old native speaker, to answer that question, before I can even start to write in English, I need to think quite hard. Okay, and I think it's important for us to realize that what is being assessed is not only English, but also a certain depth and maturity of thought. I think this happens if any of you teach Cambridge Advanced, you will probably agree that really it's a question of English, but for younger students, the question is often they're not quite sure what they are supposed to write because they haven't got that depth of thought or that maturity. And I think with rising levels, we're going to have to be more and more paying more and more attention to this question of thought, depth of thought, originality of thought, and sophistication. And maybe that's not easy, but I think that that will be in the future one very, very important part of our jobs teaching upper secondary. Another thing to think about is that if the level in general of our students is getting higher, not all students are good at all things in English. Now, sometimes we talk about mixed ability, and I always use the expression mixed abilities because very rarely are students good at everything in English or bad at everything in English. Usually, some students are good at some things in English and not so good at others. If you look at the diagram on the left, I think this is interesting. This is showing the level of 15 to 16-year-old students, but it's breaking it down according to skills. And it's fascinating to see that, of course, listening, maybe because of internet, maybe because of watching films, maybe because of all of this attention to listening to original version material, means that the level of listening is very high. But you can see that, for example, there is quite a big disbalance with speaking. And I think that we are going to have to focus in the end. We will want excellence, not in general, we will want excellence in all of the 4 different skills. And I have included a statement of results from the first certificate exam from Cambridge on the right, just to show the same thing, that nowadays on that statement of results, we have a clear breakdown of different skills and the level of the skill. And I think this will also be a reason why in the future, we will need to be helping students much more individually with problems that they have between those different levels of all 4 skills. Similarly, and I think this is a really important thing that we will have to think about even more in the future than now, is the idea of the difference between students. We are talking about a general increase in the level of students, but there will always be some students who are at a much lower or much higher level than the average. And I think we are going to have to pay special attention to somehow bridging the difference between the higher level students and the lower level students. And I think this is going to be something that has always been a problem for all teachers, but will be even more of a challenge in the future, where we will want to make sure that all of our students are achieving excellence, not just the few at the top. And I think the solution to that will probably be more to do with blended learning. So using, for example, online materials where students can go a little bit at their own pace. Students can work on their weaknesses. They can find online materials for their individual needs. The flipped classroom approach, which I'm sure some of you will know about, and I will be talking about at the IATEFL conference in Liverpool, but the flipped classroom where students can then get those videos that can help them to work on the things that they didn't get the first time. And I think the future really will be a question of this adaptive learning, personalized learning, as Karen says, sorry, that we're making sure that the students can work on their own weaknesses and at their own speed. And I think this will be a challenge for us all as teachers and as providers of material in the classroom to make sure that students can work at those different speeds and levels. And finally, this is sort of like a little bit of a joke, if you like, but I think this is quite interesting. Um, when I was working on this talk, the very first day that I started to decide to talk about this topic, I was watching the news at lunchtime, and I was suddenly bombarded in the middle of Spanish national news with lots of English. And I think that it is fascinating because I'm making a list every day now of English words being used in normal Spanish. I'm going to show you this here. Look, this is from the news program, and I'm sure that even people who don't understand Spanish will understand quite a lot of these words. It is fascinating that in Spain at the moment, people talk about el running, okay? In the same news program, El Skyline de Madrid, which I find pretty fascinating too. Why is the word skyline in English? Then I also heard the expression un performance, el share de la audiencia, all of these words. And I think that the higher that the students' level is getting, particularly younger people are just dropping English words into Spanish conversation pretty constantly. And it is fascinating to think what is going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And I'm sure this could be happening. You could maybe tell me in the chat box. Are you getting this use of English words in your own languages too? We've got sort of like in this second example, un welcome drink. I mean, why we use the expression in Spain, a welcome drink, when you could easily say this concept in Spanish? Maybe the key is that firstly, it sounds good in English. Maybe it sounds modern. Maybe it sounds different from what people are used to. It sounds innovative. But I do believe that the more and more that the newer generations are happy using this language in English, then maybe a consequence of rising levels is in 5, 10 years, we've got incredible amounts of English words almost becoming Spanish words or Korean words or whichever language you're teaching or whichever language is in your country. The words are becoming sort of part of this new English or new Spanish. Okay. Right now, maybe I've even gone ahead of time, which is fine. That's good. That means more time for questions and any comments that you'd like. Because your comments could be as well that you, in your situation, the situation is different, or maybe it's not applicable. Obviously, each situation is very different, but I would be fascinated to hear any of your similar thoughts about rising levels. Karen's talking about the flipped classroom, which, yeah, and I think this idea of personalizing language through technology is going to become a real key feature because always teaching a whole class is difficult. Even with 5 students, with 10 students, with 30 students, the difference between students is even always a difficult question. And I think we need to, as teachers, try to plan or to find materials that we can give that help students to overcome these differences in levels. By the way, while you're thinking of nice questions, you can think of difficult questions to ask me. Meanwhile, you can see there on the final screen, if you do want to contact me with any questions or comments, you're quite free to do so. I'll just mention there the Gateway Facebook page, which as you can see is full of teaching ideas. So if you're interested in getting lots of teaching ideas, teaching videos for secondary, then please come along there or simply send me an email directly. You can take that address now as we're looking at questions. Any comments? Yes, right. I mean, it is interesting how English around the world, I think, you know, the people are using English more and more. It's almost like a marketing tool, I think. Maria is interesting to say how the similar situation. Maria, where are you as a matter of interest? Spain or Mexico? Or thank you, Judy. Mexico, right? Yeah, so it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I think I've mentioned this already, but obviously there are many primary teachers probably who are watching this talk. I mean, all of the work that primary teachers, kindergarten teachers, preschool teachers are doing in English is obviously making life much more difficult. Sorry, much the opposite, is making life much easier for us as secondary school teachers. And I think that's, you know, a main reason is by the time we're getting our students, the level of the students is already pretty high. One thing that I haven't talked about, is even the knock-on effect if you are teaching adults or if you're in a private language school. Because I think there, already in Spain, there is already a very strong impact, which is that there are not many kids who have got a beginner level or a low intermediate level anymore, because basically the students already are leaving school with a high level. And that certainly has changed in Spain over 20, 30 years. Yeah. Celine, yes, you asked a question before. Um, I think 40, 45 minutes is quite a short time. It depends if it's 40, 45 minutes of real work from the beginning to the end. Often, if you're working in a secondary school, maybe you're losing time at the start and the end of a message. But I suppose often in our situation, one if you can't actually make the decision of how long your classes are, then you have to make do with what you have. But I think it's very obvious, as I said with my first slide, the more we give, the more hours of English we have, the better the results will be. And I think that's easily seen in when we try to learn a language ourselves. If you have half an hour of Turkish a week, I'm not going to do very well. If I have half an hour every day, I'm going to do better. So frequency, duration is really, really important. Okay. Yeah, Sandra from Italy. Yeah, definitely. Kindergarten, preschool, primary is all making a massive difference. And I think that's been a key factor in Spain. All of that early English is all helping. Sometimes it's difficult maybe to see that at the moment because the English is going in and is being absorbed. But I think it's quite clear in secondary that the level is, over time, the English is going in and it's staying there. Yeah. Tatiana's mentioning Russian. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I was in Russia 2 weeks ago and I love reading Russian because I suddenly think I can understand Russian because I read it and it says fitness center and business lunch. So I didn't know that I knew Russian until I read fitness center and business lunch. So I've seen the impact of English in Russia too. Okay. Hey, Evelyn from Lima. Great. I was there a long time ago, but I'd love to come back. Any more questions? This is your big chance. We've still got a few minutes left, a couple of minutes, I think. Any questions about the talk? One other aspect, I think, to bear in mind, of course, which will be a secondary effect, is that teachers will have to be happy about teaching higher levels too. And I mention this because not everybody always enjoys teaching higher levels. For example, I teach first certificate advanced and I enjoy that, but I'm not a great fan of teaching proficiency. And I think many teachers have favorite levels, and I know many people like teaching beginner levels, pre-intermediate levels, but I do believe that in the future in secondary we're going to reach a moment where most students have that high level. Yes, somebody's mentioned, Tatiana's mentioned watching films in English, TED Talks, and I do remember vividly that I was in Georgia a few years ago and I met a 10-year-old boy whose English was amazing and he learnt it all from Cartoon Network, which is pretty pretty fascinating. That's probably too much Cartoon Network, but at least he learnt English. Shall I answer this last question from Katerina? Is it okay to not overcorrect? Um, yeah, I mean, I think that when we're teaching CLIL, I think it's important that we're looking at the content, and overcorrect obviously is a negative thing, but I think it's generally true that we're going to focus on the content a lot and maybe slightly less so on the English. Or what we might want to do is to make a list of our English mistakes so that then we can come back to those at a later moment. But concentrate on the content first and maybe the English later. Okay, do
All
remember that
right.
if you want to get in touch with me, please go ahead, yeah, with those two contacts there. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave. We really appreciate your very informative talk. I also want to let people know that you will be doing a plenary session on April 1st in Liverpool. And so we really hope everyone will join us because we're really looking
Yeah,
forward to that
especially
as well.
Liverpool is my hometown, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh, so doubly exciting for you. This is wonderful. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much, everyone. A nice virtual applause for Dave. Thank you so much.